Welcome to the Ayaan Hirsi podcast, a home for critical thinking and common sense. Today on the podcast, I have with me Amy Chua. Amy Chua is a professor of law at Yale Law School. She received both her AB and her JD from Harvard University and was executive editor of the Harvard Law Review. After practicing on Wall Street, she joined the Yale Law faculty in 2001. She is the best-selling author of numerous books, including World on Fire: How Exporting Free Market Democracy Breeds Ethnic Hatred and Global Instability, The Triple Package, co-authored with Jed Rubenfeld, and her 2011 memoir, Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother, a runaway international bestseller that has been translated into 30 languages. Her latest book is Political Tribes, Group Instinct, and the Fates of Nations. In 2011, she was named one of Time magazine's 100 most influential people in the world and one of the Atlantic Monthly's brave thinkers, along with being one of Foreign Policy's global thinkers. She also received the Yale Law School's Best Teaching Award. Amy, welcome. Thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me. I've been a fan of yours for ages and ages. I would like to ask you first by telling us a little bit about what it was like to grow up in the United States as an Asian child, particularly at a time when there weren't that many Asians in America.
First of all, Ayaan, thank you so much for having me, and the feeling is mutual. I've been a fan for so long, so it's really fun to be talking to you in person. So I grew up in West Lafayette, Indiana, and this is going to sound weird because I was the only Asian in my classroom, only Asian on my street, where there were just very, very few Asian Americans, and I honestly think it was way more pleasant than it is today. Obviously, there were some downsides. Like I had my share of, the nasty little kid on the playground making fun of slanty eyes and, Chinese, Japanese kind of thing. But I was raised with tough parents. And I actually had a great childhood. I loved Indiana. I loved the Midwest. Never really minded being the only Chinese American kid. And I think part of the reason for that is that my parents actually raised me with a very, very strong sense of ethnic pride. And one of my stories I like to tell, I think I was in fourth grade, and I was a chubby kid, thick glasses, ugly clothes. My parents we didn't have any money at all, really. And I remember I pronounced the word restaurant wrong. Instead of saying restaurant, I said restaurant. And this kid, Jeremy, I still remember him, started running around the yard, making fun of me, ha, ha, ha. And I just felt horrible. But when I came home that day and told my mom about it, this is a real tiger mom. I told her how bad I felt. And she I couldn't believe her reaction. Ayaan, she was not mad at the kid. She was mad at me. She said, Amy, why do you care about that stupid boy? Such a stupid boy. It's not worth any of your time. And then this great non sequitur. She said, we come from the oldest, most magnificent civilization. We invented everything. That stupid boy can't even tell, then, don't waste 1 second with him. And so that was kind of the mentality that I grew up with. And I was the oldest of 4 girls. We were a very close family. And, very, very strict parents, had to do very well, straight A's. But I actually had a happy childhood here, very much like an outsider. But I think in some ways, I think my life is all about trying to turn being an outsider into a source of strength. And sometimes it's very hard.
I relate to what you just said now. And when I was a kid myself, my mom, when I came home and complained about being bullied at school, she made things worse for us, for me and my siblings, that we actually stopped talking about it at home.
You're kidding. I've never
really.
So what did she say? What was her reaction? Like the same kind of thing?
So we came from Somalia and we were living in Kenya at that point. And when we complained about being beaten, we used to be beaten and called all sorts of terrible names and made
Oh
fun
my
of, they
gosh.
made fun of our accent. And my mother would say, so you allowed a slave child to actually beat you? And then she would beat us herself to make sure that, we got the point. You don't let an inferior kid bully
Oh
you.
my gosh. This is such
Yeah.
a similar experience, but with 100,000 times the intensity.
Yeah.
But in your case, did you feel that led to a positive sense of strength, or was it also kind of difficult?
Well, it was difficult and we were miserable, of course. And we were
Yeah,
miserable when it was happening. But now looking back, I think obviously this is not the way I would raise my children. Uh, but in a way, I think it does make you resilient. It hardens you. And
absolutely. Yeah. So we
yeah.
are talking about the same thing. It's just that example is so, much starker. But yeah, it is, I guess, about, I mean, everybody wants to figure out how do you instill real inner strength in children, you know?
Yeah. And that is so key and it's so important, especially now, you are teaching now at Yale, but you are at Harvard first, and you look at what's going on across the board in colleges and, young people are being told you need safe spaces and treated with kid gloves. And I'm not saying that your upbringing or my upbringing should be the shining example of how to raise kids. But I think maybe now we've moved to the other extreme. What do you think of that?
I totally agree. And I've never seen my students more anxious and more miserable, and more unable to cope. Now, there's a lot of stuff going on. Of course, there was the pandemic and all the issues that come with Generation Z and student debt and all that kind of stuff. Having said that, I often observe with irony that we have so many special deans of students and everything. We start the beginning of the school year with a big lecture about mental health, and we just have so much more apparatus and bureaucracy and about this. And I've never seen my students more unhappy, actually.
Yeah.
Something is not right.
Something is not right, and we're going to come and address it. And I think I'm going to start first by highlighting your book, The Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mom. And here, not only were you have the experience of growing up as a child in the United States to Chinese parents, but then when it's your turn to parent, I have to tell you, I really enjoyed the book. It's everything. It's moving, it's entertaining, it's informative, and there's a great deal of wisdom in it. But what was it like for you to raise your daughters here?
Yeah, well, it's funny, first of all, and either people get the book or not, I thought it was going to be very funny, and a lot of immigrants' kids immediately see that it's supposed to be funny in part. But other people, read it very literally. And sometimes I really feel like, people can be from different planets. So, yeah, so the story is, my academic books, I did 3 years of research for one, 5 for another. I wrote the first 2/3 of this memoir in 3 months. It just poured out. So it was I've never written like that. I actually usually have tremendous writer's block. But it just kind of poured out. So to answer your question, I was a cocky mom. I think it's because I've always been a little overconfident, the oldest child of 4 girls, but also because of what we started talking about. I mean, I was very complaining all the time when I was growing up. Why so many rules, and why is everybody else having more fun? And my 3 sisters and I were always, what's going on? But then, after I got to college and kind of looking back as an adult, I thought, wait a minute, I want to raise my children the exact same way because, it was worth it. Like I have all these opportunities. I see people having a hard time getting jobs. And so I thought, I'm just going to do this. I don't know what everybody's problem is. And like so many people, my 2 daughters were completely different. My first daughter just fortuitously was an incredibly easy child, very self-motivated. And to tell you the truth now, I don't even know if I had to be strict with her. I mean, I think maybe she would have, now that I'm, 10 years later, I wonder if she would have been exactly the same way. But anyway, whatever I did worked very well, and she was really, great at school. So I remember thinking, what is wrong with all these Western parents? I mean, they just have to be a little firm. And
Yeah.
number two came along, Lulu, 3 years later, and she was exactly the opposite. I mean, it was even when I was carrying her, she just kicked all the time. She was born with colic. I think she wouldn't crawl until like she was 3. It was like
Oh.
really, really just a kid born saying no.
Yeah.
Incredibly cute. And I now realize that part of the issue is that she and I are so similar.
Right.
Even we're best of friends now, although we still fight, of course. But it's almost like we can read each other's minds. So for me, in some ways, the book was a really eye-opening thing. It's like, wait a minute. So the first 2/3 of the book is just me being unrelenting. Like, I am going to do this. I worked with my first kid, and I am not giving up. And
Right.
honestly, I think there were a lot of great results. The last third of the book is Lulu turning 13, and I don't know if you have any teenagers yet. I think you're a lot younger than me, but when she turned 13, all of the kind of funny part, the making up at night, just disappeared. She just got
Yeah.
incredibly alienated and angry, and that's really, in some ways, what the book is ultimately about. Like,
Yeah.
at a certain point, I realized I'm going to lose this kid. She hates me. I mean,
Yeah.
forget this Tiger Mom thing, forget colleges. So trying to figure out the right balance is something that I think is very, very difficult. And I don't, even end with any particular solutions. It is a memoir.
Yeah. Well, the solution is, how is Lulu now? Where is she at? Is she in college? How did it turn out?
She is great. She's at Harvard.
Oh, wow.
She's a second year law student, but that hides a lot.
Yeah.
It hides a lot of ups and downs and complicated issues, and um, you know, just it hides a lot. But yes, I would say that the more important thing is she and I are very close. Although, after some months together with the pandemic, we all decided she had to go back. It was better for her to be in her own apartment.
Yeah.
It's part of growing up. But yeah, I actually think that in some ways, and this sounds maybe oversimplistic, but I think if you could combine the best of East and West, um,
Yeah.
and in every particular case, it's going to be the specific balance will be different. But I think the West today has gone way too far in one direction, and this I don't know if you want to call it Asian parenting or in your just immigrant parenting or tough love parenting
Yeah.
can be really rough. It can be really rough.
Yeah, I think, yeah, maybe the answer is somewhere in the middle. And then you said, I don't know if you've had teenage kids. Well, my husband has raised teenage kids, and I don't want to take any credit for the outcome. But I do remember, similar struggles of will between him and his daughter, and actually both boys, and they're now in their 20s. And then everything turned out just fine. And so I have this sense that maybe when you have a child whose personality starts to collide with yours, and we sometimes tend to want to win,
Yeah.
and then it's literally when you let go, I don't know, that things start to straighten out. And this is what I've seen with the older children, and then
Yeah.
with no, go on.
Yeah, I think I kind of did that when I realized I was going to lose her, but um, I have such complicated views about this because I think it's a little bit more complicated, like how much to let go, and this is going to sound like a cliche, but I mean, Neil reminds me of myself because he's got a very strong personality. So there are so many things going on, which is like I had this very strong personality. Then I had 2 children with very strong personalities. And at a certain point, it does feel like it's going to be a war to the death.
Yeah.
So in that sense, letting go is important. But I feel like maybe the first principle is conveying unconditional love. And that may sound surprising, but I think it's possible to just constantly convey unconditional love, even while one is having very high expectations for children. And when that starts to come into question, when it's kind of what you said. When it starts, I found myself, wait a minute, am I just trying to win? Am I not even behaving like a parent anymore? It's like we're just two children fighting. Is my message not coming through that I really ultimately love her? I think that's when I realized I had to kind of change course for a bit.
Right, right. And talking of changing course, I wanted to move now to the topic of your next book, which again, I am reading with great pleasure. And I really recommend it to everyone. I can't think of a book that's more timely. The title of the book is Political Tribes, Group Instinct and the Fate of Nations. Amy, on the back, it says it's a bold new prescription for both foreign policy and domestic affairs. Let's start with domestic affairs. We are seeing a tribalizing of America. And my gosh, the way you describe it. First of all, you begin by saying Americans in their foreign policy barely, if at all, understand tribes and the tribal spirit. And then you move from there to the second half of the book where you say, now it's going on here and we still don't get it. So let's start with the home front. I say that now because of our politics.
Yes, it's so bad. And, in some ways, you and I have both been at the center of the, of the ugliness that this causes. One of the things I tried to answer is, what is different about this moment? Because, there's always been, many, many problems, a lot of divisions in this country. But what is different about this particular moment? And I identified two very clear factors. The first is something that may seem so obvious, but I think it's really critical, and that is the massive demographic transformation that this country has been experiencing in the last, well, especially the last 20 years. And specifically, for the first time in U.S. history, whites are on the verge of losing their majority status at the national level. For 200 years, whites were economically, politically, culturally dominant. And along with such dominance by one group, of course, you can see many terrible things, slavery, all kinds of things that don't need to be recounted. But when one group is so dominant, they can also afford to be kind of more generous, as weird as that sounds. I mean, so, in the 60s and 70s, the blue-blooded WASP elites basically opened up the Ivy League voluntarily to Jews and minorities and Asians, kind of because they just thought it was the right thing to do. Fast forward to today, all of that is gone. Today, it's not just, minorities, African Americans, Native Americans, Asian Americans who feel threatened. Whites feel threatened. All these statistics show that I think it's like, a majority of whites feel that they are more discriminated against than minorities. And there's actually a lot of reason to feel that way between affirmative action and all these, just kind of what you're seeing. But so putting aside, who's right, that's how they feel. And these studies show that it's when groups feel threatened, that's when they retreat into this kind of insular tribalism, this kind of us versus them mentality. And, it's not just religious minorities now who feel threatened. Christians feel threatened. So that's one factor. And it does feel like this, everything is descending into this zero-sum. Democracies become a vehicle for zero-sum political tribalism. It's one group, every group out for themselves. So that's one factor. And I could talk about the other one if...
Yes, please. I think it's... yeah.
So the other factor goes back to actually the very first book that I wrote back in 2002 that nobody's ever really heard of, although Neil Ferguson and I sort of had our first debate in which we made everybody mad. It was a human rights convention, and we were supposed to debate with each other, and then we ended up agreeing with each other and making the entire audience mad. But in this book, it was called World on Fire, How Exporting Free Market Democracy Breeds Hatred and Global Instability. I coined a term called market dominant minorities. And this is something that people in the United States were, basically completely unfamiliar with. And this is the idea of a small ethnic minority, like, for example, the Chinese in Indonesia, that are
Right.
tiny numerically, 3% of the population.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
and yet they control as much as 70% of the private economy.
Right.
Same with, my parents are Chinese from the Philippines originally. The Chinese in the Philippines are only 1% of the population in the Philippines,
Right.
but
Yeah.
control as much as 60%. And it's a very taboo book, it was my first controversial
No,
book.
but I mean, not to, I mean, end up agreeing with you, but I obviously grew up in East Africa, and the South Asians, they are a very small minority, but they are, indeed, they will fit the description of our market's dominant minority. And
Exactly. And
yeah,
I
and
bring
then,
them up. And you know what's so funny is this early beginnings of political correctness. At the beginning, everyone's like, you can't say that. You must be stereotyping people. And I was like, no, I am documenting their actual economic dominance. And the Lebanese and West Africa and,
yeah,
and even whites in South Africa. So the reasons for market dominance can vary, can range from apartheid to more complicated issues like why were they so dominant between the First and Second World War in Eastern Europe? But
yeah,
anyway, going back to the United States, what I said is there's a second factor that is leading to the kind of intense tribalism we're seeing. And that is that for the first time in our history, we are seeing the emergence of our own very idiosyncratic version of a market dominant minority. And it's not a perfect fit because it's not an ethnic minority. It's not like Chinese or it's not a religious minority. But this group that I now see is operating like a very resented tiny market dominant minority are the group that people call coastal elites or cosmopolitan elites. And the dynamic fits almost perfectly because it is in fact the case that wealth in this country is incredibly concentrated on in a very small handful of people on the east and west coasts, and that this group actually does largely control, Wall Street and Silicon Valley and the Ivy League and Hollywood and Washington and in World on Fire, I said that when you have this resented minority that is viewed as controlling the levers of power from afar, then democracy can become a vehicle for a really vitriolic kind of populism or ethno-nationalism, where you have this large, poor, often less educated majority saying, "Wait a minute, this outsider minority, they don't even care about, in this case, real Americans. They care more about the poor in Africa, and they want to let all these immigrants in. They don't care about us." And if you look at what President Donald Trump did, his rhetoric is, make America great again. It's kind of like, let's take America back from the Chinese and the Muslims and the Mexicans. And it's very similar to calls in countries like Zimbabwe, Zimbabwe for real Zimbabweans, or get the Chinese out of Indonesia. So that's the second factor. Again, it's not a perfect analogy.
And it's not a perfect analogy, but it's good to have it as a sort of framework for building at least, these thoughts around. But one question on these coastal elites. One thing you said about, let's say, I'll just call them the WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, when they were the dominant group, you said that they had this trait of generosity, that they opened institutions to the minorities that were once excluded. Are these coastal minorities displaying similar generous attitudes towards those in, say, flyover country? How do I interpret? You did say a little bit about what Trump is saying. Yeah, please get into that.
Very interesting. So first of all, these cosmopolitan elites or coastal elites are not all white. In fact,
Of course.
my student J.D. Vance, who wrote Hillbilly Elegy, said that Barack Obama is actually the classic example of a cosmopolitan elite. He sounds professorial. He strikes the people in flyover country as very arrogant,
Right.
and so I would say my answer to you, I've never actually thought of that, is no. There is something, this might be provocative, but if you listen to the way, if I talk to my colleagues at Yale, you can't believe the amount of disdain that cosmopolitan elites have for, let's just call it like President Trump's base,
Yeah.
And again, I'm not saying justified or not justified, but just in terms of your question, it's the opposite of generosity. It's,
Yeah.
you hear people, it's oh, these, racist, ignorant people. You almost see strands of they shouldn't be voting, because since they
Yeah.
favor authoritarianism, and this is something that you see in developing countries a lot that we
Yeah.
never really saw in the United States. But where you see elites saying, you know what, we don't actually want the majority voting.
Yeah.
I mean, we
Yeah.
saw this with Jim Crow, of course, in the context of race in the South. But now you see a lot of people, you know, there's just a lot of disdain and mutual distrust between, these two big groups in the United States.
And so there is the lack of generosity on, I would say, the elite side. And again, this obviously doesn't apply to every single member or every single group. And what I would agree with you is these coastal elites are not necessarily white.
Yes.
What struck me in the last few days, we are recording now on the end of May 2021, 2021. What struck me, but I don't want to put words in your mouth. When these collisions happen between a market dominant minority or a minority that's perceived to be dominant in some way and the larger population, I don't know how to frame the question, but is there, what is sacrificed? What does the dominant minority do to continue to be dominant and to be seen to be doing things right, but without actually making any changes to their dominance, to their status?
Yeah, it's very complicated. Well, first of all, I actually want to go back to something you said. I think this mutual disdain and distrust is on both sides.
Right.
You just have to flip back and forth between Fox News and MSNBC. You could see that we've gotten to a point where half the country, everybody views the people who voted for the other side as not just kind of people they want to disagree with, but actually as un-American. The other side is evil, and you see
Yeah.
these statistics. You see these statistics where it used to be, my daughter married a Republican or a Democrat, and you
Yeah.
have arguments at Thanksgiving dinner, but in the end you all have drinks and it's fine. Now you see these polls. It's like 90% of Democrats. I don't have the exact statistics. Say that they would be miserable, do not want their children to marry somebody from the opposite political party and vice versa. So it really is. Now, to kind of answer your very interesting question, it's difficult to answer because I think we are just talking right past each other,
Yeah.
and I don't think I think there are quiet voices. To take this to a very personal level, at Yale Law School where I teach, I apparently have one of the few classes where both Republicans and Democrats, liberals and conservatives, and extremely progressive, people who favor critical race theory can also be in the same class as people from the Federalist Society. And I try to structure these debates, and I've been very proud of it. But I'm barely surviving at Yale Law School. That is, there's some people that object to that. So my point is that I think it's so hard now to be above the fray, to say, oh, let's try to hear both sides, because immediately you get, oh, that's both siderism. If one side are Nazi, racist, xenophobes, you can't talk to them. So I just find it to be very distressing on all sides.
It is distressing. But again, in terms of the coastal elite, another feature is that they present themselves as the protectors of the oppressed. And the oppressors are those they define along lines of race, sexuality, gender, and all these other things. And what I find striking, I mean, I'm among, obviously, smack in the middle of the coastal elites. But what I find interesting when we're having these conversations is that we are, in fact, not surrounded at all. We're not in contact with, they're not part of the community of the people whose interests we are supposedly protecting.
100%. I couldn't agree more. And I've had, and I guess I technically belong to this group, but I have had such a similar experience, where people seem to think that they know better for minorities,
Yeah. Yeah.
and there's nothing that gets more vitriol than a minority that is. I hate these labels. We describe them as
Yeah.
a conservative minority. Why are you even calling them conservative? And this
Yeah.
is part of the problem. Like, you have certain views that are brilliant and intense and come from your personal experience. Um, Instead of respecting that and marveling and wanting to learn, and maybe your other side is free to disagree, I've seen how they just say, that's not allowed. That is not allowed. And I've had so much of this myself. Somebody asked me the other day, they said, why did you retweet this person? And I guess
Yeah.
this person was technically viewed as very right wing. And I said, because I retweet anybody who I think is making an intelligent point, and it's
Yeah.
so cowardly. Like, oh my gosh, you're afraid to signal one thing or another. I mean, such brilliant, intelligent people living cowering, terrified that they're going to be canceled. It's really ridiculous.
It is ridiculous because they think, I thought you were part of my tribe. And
Right.
now you're, yeah, you're betraying me because you're tweeting someone in a positive way from some other tribe. Amy, another interesting factor, and anyway, these are just teeny tiny observations, not based on any kind of studies, is when in fact a minority gets singled out within, and this I'm still focusing on the coastal elite, for condemnation, all the rhetoric about standing up for minorities and standing up for what's just and right, it all disappears out of the window.
Instantly.
And I'm saying this looking at the anti-Semitism in display today. I said we're recording end of May, so May 25, 2021. There's just been a ceasefire in this, conflict that goes on and on and on. It's been going on my entire life. Between the Palestinians and the state of Israel. And this time is different in America, not in Europe, but it's different in America, that it's come not only with condemnations of the Israeli policies, but it's come with condemnations of Jews, Zionism, being Jewish. There's a great deal of anti-Semitism online and even in Congress and other places. And now I'm wondering, where are all these heroes who are coming, protecting the rights of minorities? That is the minority, if I can only think of.
Yeah, there's absolutely no symmetry or kind of consistency or logic. It's more like these positions, these tribal positions, have certain markers. Like, these are the items, these are the positions you have to have, and these tribes can get smaller and smaller. I mean, I think it's actually kind of untenable, because it's on every dimension. You have to have these views, and I agree with you that it's something different. I mean, I have students that, and fellow professors, it's all these topics now, they're just like, let's just steer completely clear of them, let's, or even in criminal law, one person will say this view, that I think we should not have criminal law, at all criminal law. This is in a law school. And, look, that person, there's a lot of reason to want to argue that. I think that's interesting. But then the point is that everybody should be able to push back and challenge and debate. And then you could, hopefully arrive at some sort of, closer to the truth. But instead, if you hear a statement like that, I've had students say, oh, it's just not worth it. I don't want to be shamed, and nobody pushes back, and there's no discussion, And I think it's very similar with the point that you're raising, on questions of Israel and anti-Semitism. It's everything just gets shut down completely. And it is a very bad situation right now.
It's a terrible situation. And if we're internally divided the way we are now, we have our own zero-sum game tribes. How on earth is this going to affect our foreign policy? Because what kind of, as a nation then, what kind of strength can we radiate toward adversaries like, the Communist Party of China, Putin, some of these Middle Eastern autocrats? The parts that deals with foreign policy in your book is about the lack of understanding or insight into how tribalism and ethnocentrism works in this case you describe when we went to Afghanistan and Iraq and all these other places, and even in Vietnam, between the relationship between the Vietnamese and the Chinese. But now here we are, completely mired in our own tribal, actually cosmetic
Yes. Yeah.
tribal qualities. And how are we going to face the rest of the world?
Yeah, and I even have a line in there. I said, the United States has never been able to, has been interestingly very different from the British, who were very, very,
Yes.
again, for better or worse, but very into divide and conquer. They knew all the different caste systems and how these things operated, and they used it, to their advantage in many ways. The United States, for I think history, for reasons I think having to do with our kind of unique success with assimilation, obviously not perfect given slavery, but with all these immigrants, very quickly within 1 or 2 or 3 generations, Italian Americans marrying Irish Americans and Polish Americans and German Americans, had a very naive impression of how to handle diversity. And I have a line that, at this point, it seems like we do not have a mechanism. We are not handling our own diversity in at all an impressive way. So I agree with you. How can we be a role model? One of the things that I, say was always very special about the United States. And, I don't know how you would think about this. I coined this term supergroup. It's not very complicated. The idea of a supergroup is it's a country that, number one, satisfies 2 conditions. The first is to have a very strong overarching national identity, whether it's, American, or French. But the second condition of being a supergroup is you have to allow all these individual subgroup identities to flourish, not quash them. And when I was growing up, admittedly there were far fewer immigrants. The United States at its best was a place where you could be Cuban American or Korean American or Somali American or Irish American and still be very patriotic at the same time. And I think that this was something that we should really celebrate. You look at China. China is not a supergroup because it satisfies the first condition. It has a very strong overarching, but obviously the Uyghurs, the Tibetans, the subgroup identities are not permitted to flourish, even exist. And I would imagine the countries that many of them don't satisfy the first condition. They don't have this thing to tie the country together. And what I worry about in the United States right now is that we are starting to lose that first condition. We are just splintering into smaller and smaller groups, and even patriotism, the idea of patriotism and nationalism has been tribalized. That is now completely associated with Republicans, and it makes no sense. I mean, there's no reason why that should be. So that's one concern I really have about the direction that we're going. What's going to hold this country together, given all the increasing diversity?
And that's a legitimate concern. It really is alarming, because in order to continue to satisfy that first condition of nationhood and nationality, you do have to you have to tell the story of the great story. And it might have some mythical connotations, but I think in America, it's largely true, is that what is it that makes this country unique? What makes it different? The founding principles, the Constitution, the Declaration, the relentless attempts at trying to live by those norms. I know, of course, we made all these terrible mistakes, slavery, but for me, what's appealing about the American story is all humanity had slaves, but it is the Americans who decided not to have it anymore and to have a war of it. And again, you pointed out to where I come from, where we're divided along tribes and castes sometimes, and people are subjugated based only on their ethnicity, their skin color, even gender. This is a different topic. But it's only the Americans, or largely the Americans, that decided, you know what, we don't want this anymore. And they fought, and we had the civil rights movement. And so rights and freedoms were given to everyone. We try and continue to do that. I think we have to tell a story that is appealing to all of these different groups that they can all talk about. And what you're saying is, now it's really left only to the Republicans, and everyone else has ditched that story. And all we try to do is remember the bad stuff.
Yes, you put it so beautifully. I always try to tell my students are extremely left-wing, and I always try to say, look, there's an important distinction between saying, we have these great principles that we have repeatedly and shamefully failed to live up to, but we got to keep trying to live up to those principles. There's a huge difference between saying that and saying that, all these principles are just phony smoke screens. Actually, this is a country that's built entirely on the principle of white supremacy and genocide. And I see that conflation all the time, and I could not agree with you more that it's a gift that this country, for all of its terrible mistakes, our founding identity was ethnically neutral. Not the way we applied it, but in these principles in our Constitution were, no one race, no one religion, no one ethnicity owns this country. And I agree with you. It's almost now you see, a lot of people, principally on the left, throwing the baby out with the bathwater, saying, these founding fathers were just white male rapists. And so what is going to be left? I think I've had a headmaster of a very fancy New York private school who's white came to me in distress and said, Amy, 90% of my students now have utter disdain for the founding fathers, and I can't say anything as a white male. I don't know what to do.
Oh,
yeah. It's
well, maybe we no longer have to rely on white males to do
it.
Right?
Good point.
So, Amy, give me some hope for the future. What are you optimistic about?
Oh, you're catching me at a tricky time. I'm in the middle of a cancellation campaign. What gives me hope is looking at my own context, the Yale Law School where I teach, which is probably maybe the most liberal and progressive campus in the entire country. I believe there is a very significant silent majority. That is my honest impression. I believe that what you hear out there, and that actually what runs the show, unfortunately, and what administrators make their decisions on the basis of, what all the publications and the way we run things is based on, is actually a relatively small, very vocal minority that just complains and gets their way. So I don't know how we change that, but my hope lies in the fact that I have had so many students who don't want to protest, don't want to make a big deal, but they also want to just learn and write books. They don't want to spend their time being canceled, so they don't say anything. So my hope is that what gives me hope is that I think that the vast majority of Americans are tired of all this tribalism and all this hatred. It's exhausting. But how we actually turn that into a more sane world is something that I think we're still working on.
Yeah, right. Maybe the subject of your next book.
I don't know. Yeah.
That silent majority, and how to mobilize them to come out and, work on that, what the glue of the nation, what keeps us together, what binds us together, not what divides us. Amy, thank you so much. This was eye-opening and amazing, and I can't thank you enough. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, you're so welcome. Thank you. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Ayaan Hirsi Ali podcast. Next week, we've got another exciting guest for you. If you're enjoying these conversations, please subscribe to support this podcast at ayaanhirsiali.com.